The morning after Lai and Vin helped at Diok Hamlet, the mountain looked as if it had been combed the wrong way. Bamboo slanted, soil freckled with stones newly promoted to the surface, and the creek ran thinner, embarrassed by last night's boast. Mai tied a scarf over her hair, slipped a knife into her belt, and told Han they were going to pay a call. "Is the hill still angry?" Han asked, skipping to keep up. "The hill is tired," Mai said. "Angry is loud." Tired as heavy, Diok sat in a fold of slope where echoes learned to walk. The path in had been propped with bundles of brush bound with twine, and footprints had written a fresh language in the mud. Broad, narrow, quick, dragging. When Mai and Han reached the first house, they found Mrs. Ba crouched by a collapsed wall, coaxing a pot into boiling with sticks too damp for certainty. "You came," Mrs. Ba said, the way people say weather is weather. She did not stand. Standing costs a coin you may want later. "We brought ginger and salt," Mai said, "and a pair of arms. One small, one medium." She tilted her head toward Han. They worked without making ceremony of it. Mai sawed bamboo while Han ferried pieces light enough for her to own. A neighbor arrived with stakes, another with a coil of wire, and working together made the day move faster than a single pair of hands could persuade it to. When Lai appeared at noon, dusty and pretending not to limp, he took in the scene and began to sing a silly song about hammers that insisted on being spoons. Laughter laid a clean cloth over the weariness. At the far end of the hamlet, the path turned mean. Here was where the slab had slipped, revealing a stubborn red earth that remembered being rock. Vin squinted at the grade, set his shovel, and cut a channel that would ask the next rain to choose a kinder route. "Water is lazy," he said to Han, who watched solemnly. "Give it an easier way, and it will take it." "Like a person," Han said, then looked up at Mai to judge whether that was too bold. "Like a person," Mai agreed, passing him a wedge of rice cake saved in a cloth. Vin ate grateful, as a hired man who had found an honest employer. By late afternoon, Diok looked less wounded, more bandaged. No one declared victory. In places like this, victory is almost always just for now, and everyone knows it, but for now can get you to evening, and evening can get you to sleep, and sleep can get you to morning. That is a kind of theology. As they left, Mrs. Ba pressed 3 duck eggs into Mai's palm. "For the little accountant," she said, nodding at Han, "so she can count to 3 with her mouth." Han cupped the eggs as if they were new moons. "I will count them on my tongue," she promised, and the adults laughed, grateful for the clean joke. A week later, word came up the ridge. The pass was open for a truck due at dusk, and Auntie Mian wanted strong backs. Also, she added with a twist of her mouth that signaled gossip, "A man with a clipboard will be there." "Which kind?" Lai asked. In these hills, clipboards came in flavors, some bitter, some merely bland. "The kind that makes boxes to tick," Mian said. "Maybe the kind that promises a grader for the road if we promise our patience." They went as a small procession, Mai with a coil of rope, Han with a basket for good luck, Li and Vin with hands that had now become known to the market's doors and crates. The truck arrived on time, an event so unusual it felt like a holiday. The driver wore a hat with a soft brim and the look of a man who had argued with a river and won by sideways tactics. They unloaded sacks that stank of fertilizer and miracle, tins that promised oil, rolls of plastic sheet that would serve as roofs and then as tarps and then as something else when imagination required it. The night came on warm, and the lamps along the aisle did their small part against the dark. Oil hissed from grill pans, laughter made a fresco on the air. Then the man with the clipboard appeared, his shirt clean enough to be an accusation. He introduced himself as Min Kwang from the district office and smiled with the weary brightness of a man who knows. His smile is being watched as evidence. He asked practical questions, wrote numbers with a steady hand, and listened better than his shirt suggested. When he reached their corner, he paused at the sign that Lai had chalked on a piece of board, "Upland Melons, water you can hold." "Who wrote that?" Kwang asked. "Guilty," Lai said. "We sell water that won't run off the table." Kwang smiled. Poetry as marketing." "Will you come speak at the commune meeting? We're discussing slope stabilization. People listen better if the words taste like something." Lai shook his head. Ask Mai. She makes soup that convinces men to mend fences. If the plan is a good one, her sentences will make it seem like theirs. Kwang turned to Mai. We have a program for planting vetiver grass along the terrace edges. It knots roots like a net. We have some budget. If the budget arrives before the rain does. He spread his hands, apologetic. You know how roads are, paper and dirt both. Mai said, bring the grass. We'll bring the holes. Kwang nodded, wrote another note, asked Han her name, and listened gravely to the child's demonstration of 9 times 6. Your 7s have a cross, Han said, peeking at his figures. I like mine plain. Everyone makes their own 7, Kwang said, so they can recognize it at a distance. Before he left, he bought a melon, and without bargaining, paid the chalked price. Markets remember such gestures. Auntie Mien watched him go, then leaned in. He will be good, she said, as if naming the weather. Not perfect, but good. After the truck had emptied and the paperwork had been awed into coherence, the market settled into its softer self. Vin learned how to bind boxes with twine in a way that made knots easy for future hands to admire. Lai traded 2 jokes for a small bag of peppercorns that had traveled farther than any of them would this year. Han fell asleep on a sack of rice like a puppet with its strings cut. They carried her home under a sky that had been combed flat by a wind that wanted no arguments. The dog announced them, then forgave them their lateness when Han drooped against its neck and murmured the arithmetic of dreams. The vetiver grass came 2 weeks later, riding in the back of a truck that also carried barley sugar, cheap sandals, and a man who played a bamboo flute so well the sparrows judged him and found him acceptable. Kwang came along, sweat darkening his collar. He supervised by not supervising, handing tools, carrying bundles, and only pulling out the clipboard when someone asked for the comfort of a rectangle of paper with official letters on it. They planted along the terrace edges, hands full of grass tucked into lines that drew themselves the way edges do when you look and listen and try to imagine how water thinks. Vin set stakes on the corners, and Lai checked the flow channel he and Mai had argued into behaving. Han fetched water in a small pail and poured with the ceremony of a priestess. At midday, Mie ladled soup into bowls for anyone within arm's length of the pot. Mrs. Ba from Diok ate too, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and said, Your soup tastes like the field told it a story and it listened. It's just eggplant, Mai said, embarrassed. Just eggplant, Mrs. Ba snorted, and the hill's memory and the hand that stirs. Kwang ate, standing up. If I had this soup in my district office, the budgets would arrive on time, he said. We would have to guard against corruption of appetite. Budgets don't travel alone, Lai said. They bring cousins. They worked until the slope looked bristled with purpose. Then, as if to test them, the sky darkened in a way that made all the older people glance at the edges of things. The wind carried a smell sharp as tin. The first drops were big enough to count. Cover the new planting, Kwang said, and everyone moved at once. The rain came down with the temper of a scolded child, determined to have the last word. It battered, needled, slapped. The brush bundles at the foot of the terrace drank and then pleaded fullness. The channel insisted on discovering its limits. Not enough, Vin said, his voice flat with calculation. We need a wing fence here. He pointed to a spot where water hesitated, gathered confidence, and lunged toward the fragile edge. Lai was already dragging the roll of plastic. Wing fence is a rich man's phrase, he said. Here we call it a please just for now fence. They cobbled one together, stakes, wire, the plastic taut enough to ask water to revise its opinion. Han stood in the lee of the house, eyes wide but not frightened, clutching the dog's collar as if the animal were the anchor and she the boat. Mai tightened knots with a fierce, practical tenderness that would shame any storm into better manners. Kwang shed his clean shirt caution and hammered stakes with the kind of vigor that gets mentioned in later retellings, as proof that officials can be human in weather. And still the rain came, and still the water insisted on wanting the edge that gravity whispered into its ear. The terrace lip began to ooze. A rivulet found a seam. It widened into a smile that was not kind. "Sandbags," Mai said, though no bags of sand lived here. "Rice sacks," Vin said, "filled with mud. The hill won't know the difference." They filled sacks with the nearest dirt and stacked them like an argument, improvised but fluent. The oozing gave a grudging sigh. The water thought about its options. The plastic fence shivered and then decided to be brave. The channel, insulted, reasserted its right of way. Minutes lengthened into something long enough for belief to climb into them and look around. The rain, tired of its own tantrum, reduced itself to a lecture. The wind lost interest. The sky unclenched. When it was over, everyone slid down against any surface that would hold them and made the small, incoherent sounds of relief. Han exhaled in a way that sounded like a word without letters. The dog shook itself and treated the mud as a suggestion rather than a fact. Quang laughed, startled by his own voice. "That," he said to no one and everyone, "was a vote." "What did we vote for?" Lai asked, slapping water from his sleeves. "Staying," Quang said simply. "Against the weather's campaign to make us leave." They took inventory, a few stakes bent, a length of wire to be replaced, 20 rice sacks now committed to a career outside their job description. The vetiver grass, flattened, already began to lift its green eyebrows again. "Soup," Mai said, which in this place meant a return to sanity. They ate standing, sitting, leaning, the bowls warming hands that had learned again what fingers are good for. Vin's eyes shone with the particular brightness a man gets when he has found the shape of his usefulness and it fits. "You tied that fence as if you've done it before," Lai said. "I tied a marriage once," Vin said, not bitter. "It didn't hold." He gestured toward the terrace. "This does." No one said anything worth writing down after that. Sometimes silence is the grammar you need. The grader finally came, late enough to be a joke, early enough to be a blessing. It crawled up the track like a fat beetle and left behind a surface that, while not smooth, no longer plodded to throw riders at every corner. Quang came along, took measurements no one understood, and sat on my step afterward with a glass of tea, like a man who had earned the right to do nothing for 6 minutes. "The district wants a story," he admitted. "They prefer stories to numbers. Numbers look like blame. Stories look like coupons." "What kind of story?" Mai asked. "The kind that makes city people think their taxes are seeds and not rain." Li laughed. "Tell them this. We learned to ask water to change its mind." Quang wrote that down and underlined it. "And tell me this, why melons? Why not another crop?" Mai thought about all the answers, soil, history, the way melon flesh holds winter's promise in a wet summer. "Because they are heavy and generous," she said. "Because when you cut them, you see the shape of enough." Quang nodded, a small bow to the altar of practicality. "And the soup?" he asked, because even officials know where the real power sits. "The soup is insurance," Lai said quickly, "against despair." They took a photograph none of them would ever frame, because their lives were not the sort that made room on walls for pictures. In it, Han stands in front, with 2 fingers raised, for reasons known only to her, the dog half blurred, Lai looking like a man who tells jokes to keep the cliff from leaning any closer, Vin holding a shovel with the affection of a man who has finally found the right animal to domesticate, and Mai steady as a fence post in a good year. The road held, not perfectly, no road here ever does, but enough to make market days less like a wager and more like a plan. The melons sold themselves some weeks, and other weeks needed Lai's singing and Han's arithmetical charm. The grilled pork vendor saved the ends for Han. The noodle man saved the news for Lai. Auntie Mien saved her best laugh for the moment Vin found the right twine and tied it like a promise. The market learned to ask after Deok, after the vetiver, after the house lower down the slope. Stories cross-pollinate like corn when the wind is feeling helpful. School wrote letters home. The teacher, in a hand that leaned forward as if eager to arrive, said Han's numbers were nimble and her stories precise. "She counts to belong," the teacher wrote. "Encourage her to count to understand." Mai folded the note as carefully as she folded the harvest money, slid it into the purse with the coins, and felt richer than the numbers said. At night, when the chores had been sung to sleep and the lamp made its small gold ring on the table, Mai kept a ledger, not only rice and salt and school fees, though those marched in obedient columns. She kept another tally too, one that lived between lines, bags of vetiver planted, fences asked politely to stand firm, laughs traded at cost, bowls of soup delivered into the hands of people who didn't know they were hungry for that exact kindness. If anyone had asked, she would have called it the account of enough. Vin began to take orders for small carpentry jobs, stools, a shelf, a clever contraption that let Auntie Mienne tip hot oil with less risk to wrists. He didn't get rich, he got known, which in some economies is the more reliable currency. When he walked the ridge at dusk, he no longer counted what he had lost. He counted posts that stood straight, steps cut into clay that had not slumped since last week, voices that called his name as if it had always belonged here. Lai kept being Lai, part salesman, part rescuer, part court jester to a court that accepted laughter as policy. He answered calls in the night, sang to cows and children and the occasional functionary whose pen had stalled over a form. Once, when the river refused a truck for an entire day, he persuaded it with stones and curses and a story about water that eventually bored the river into compliance. Han grew into her multiplication tables the way the terrace walls grew into their roots, incrementally, stubbornly, with a cheerfulness that did not ask the weather for permission. She began keeping a notebook of her own, prices, observation, tallies of eggs. In the back, she wrote sentences that tried hard to turn the day into knowledge. A wall is a promise you stack. A road is a memory you smooth. A melon is water that agreed to be held. When she showed Mai, the woman laughed first and then didn't. You write like someone who will argue with officials by smiling. Like you, Han said. Like the soup, Lai suggested, and everyone agreed because everything tasted better when the soup was nearby. It had to happen, a storm that did not come in lectures but in door-kicking shouts. Late in the season, when everyone had let out the breath they were saving for bad news, the sky arrived with receipts. The first hour was bold, the second hour had intent. By the third, even the bamboo lowered its eyes, the channel they had cut took the water and sent it along like a polite host escorting an unruly guest to the door. The vetiver clenched its jaw and held. The wing fence remembered its job and did it with only a small complaint. But the lower lip of the old terrace, the place where memory keeps its secrets, started to soften as if the earth were reconsidering its career. They moved like actors repeating a well-rehearsed scene. Sacks, stakes, rope, shouts. Kwang appeared impossibly with two men from the district and a coil of geotextile that might as well have been magic. They rolled it out and pinned it with stones, and the hill blinked, reconsidered, and decided to postpone its escape attempt. In the midst of it, Han, who had been told to stay under the eaves, did an act of arithmetic that would become family legend. She counted the sacks and the stakes and the available hands and declared, "We need 5 more sacks to make 6 rows of 4. 6 rows of 4 is 24, Lai said automatically, hauling. We have 19. 21, Han corrected. The 2 new ones from the shed. We need 3 more. This small insistence on exactness saved them a minute that mattered. 3 more sacks went down. A flow that had been looking for a place to argue found itself with nothing left to say. The lips stopped slumping. The storm, having made its point and exhausted its malice, walked away muttering. The night returned to being night. They stood in the aftermath, soaked, streaked, smiling in the way of people whose faces don't know yet that they are finished. Kwang shook Lai's hand as if they were exchanging titles to land. Vin leaned his shovel against the wall and leaned his head against the shovel. Mai kissed Han's wet hair and did not wipe her own eyes because rain was already doing the job. Back inside, the soup was not hot enough. It did not matter. They ate and laughed like people who had almost dropped something valuable and caught it with their knees and now needed to spend some gratitude. The dog lay on its side and snored at a volume that could have offended a less forgiving family. This will be the story, Kwang said quietly. as if drafting a report to a deity. Not that we never flooded, that we learned to fail more slowly, that we bought ourselves time. Time is the currency of staying, Mai said. And the price of leaving, Lai added, because he could never resist the second line of a couplet. Han, who had nearly fallen asleep into her bowl, mumbled, 6 rows of 4, and the adults laughed with too much relief to explain why that was as good as a prayer. By the time the melon vines tired of their own generosity and the ginger decided the soil had told it enough secrets for one season, the hills had learned a new arrangement of trust. The road remembered them, the terrace held, the market kept its corner for their cloth and jokes, the ledger of enough balanced more days than it didn't. Vin's shelves held straight even when the weather lied. He sent a little money to the city, not to a wife who had already taken the child in the future and gone, but to a friend who was learning that leaving and arriving are often the same door. Lai's motorcycle found 3 new rattles and 1 new virtue. It always started on the second try, if you asked politely. Kwang's clipboard collected notes that turned into a small pilot program with a dull name and a quiet success rate. Auntie Mian's laughs got louder. The noodle man learned to make a broth that could make a laborer cry and then deny it with dignity. Han kept counting things, beads, sacks, raindrops, stars. She wrote a sentence in the back of her notebook that Mai found months later when cleaning. We are rich in people who come when the road is bad. When the next market festival came, a noisy, generous day with a brass band whose brass was mostly hope, they brought melons and soup and a stool Vin had made that fit a grandmother's knees like an apology. The band played something that wanted to be a march and instead became a waltz. Children ran, men pretended to argue so they could agree later in a way that tasted sweeter. Women measured each other, not against a mirror but against the year, and found the measure mostly merciful. As dusk laid its hand on the town, Lai stood on a crate and told the story of the wing fence. He told it badly, which is to say he told it truthfully. Halting where fear still lived, skipping where memory didn't want to look too closely, lingering where courage had surprised them. He ended with a bow toward the terrace that had decided, for now, to remain a terrace. The applause was not loud, it was better than loud. It was the sound of people recognizing themselves. They walked home under a sky that had practiced its stars back into place. The dog greeted them with an accusation and then forgave them with a yawn. The house took them in, still patched, still proud. The lamp made its little gold country on the table. The soup announced itself, forgiving all hungers. "Mom," Han said as she washed her hands, "what is the difference between a promise and a plan?" "A plan uses paper," Mai said. "A promise uses hands." "And a story?" "A story is how we remember which promises we kept and why they ate. They used the soft words people earn the right to use only after the hard ones. They made small plans with big hearts. They stacked promises like stones where the earth needed reminding. They slept as if the night were a roof. There would be other rains, there would be other clipboards, there would be other market days that ended with too many coins or not enough, and children who grew into their numbers and then beyond them, and roads that forgave their own ruts. But in that house, on that hill with those people, the arithmetic of enough held. And if anyone came asking again what life in the uplands was like, Mai would hand them a bowl of soup before she answered, and then she would say, with a nod toward the door where the road began, "Here, we keep the hill by keeping each other."